Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into a world that smells like damp hay, sweat, and the occasional waft of something you really don't want to identify. You're standing in the middle of a medieval village square, mud squelching underfoot, chickens squawking as they dart past, and somewhere in the distance, a pig rooting through the garbage heap like it owns the place. Spoiler alert, it probably does. You're about to embark on a journey through how people got married in the Middle Ages. Spoiler alert number 2. It's not exactly the candlelit romance you might have imagined. In fact, you probably won't survive this, emotionally, at least. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Oh, and drop your location and local time in the comments. I'm curious where in the world you're tuning in from while we unravel these medieval messes. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wander down a dirt path flanked by crooked timber houses with thatched roofs, the air thick with the mingling scents of livestock, stale ale, and wood smoke. It's early evening, but the village doesn't slow down. Kids chase each other with wooden swords, while the blacksmith's hammer rings out a steady rhythm nearby, a heartbeat to this chaotic little world. You imagine the buzz and chatter of neighbors, their daily struggles blending with the excitement that today, someone somewhere is getting married. But don't get too dreamy just yet. Marriages in this time were less about love and more about survival, alliance, and social order. You're entering a society where the concept of romantic love as the foundation for marriage hasn't quite taken hold. Instead, marriage is a strategic transaction, a way to secure land, wealth, or political ties. And if you think this means it's all boring and dry, well, buckle up. The stories you're about to hear are often weird, sometimes tragic, and always fascinating. You might be wondering how all this worked in a world without phones, dating apps, or even privacy. Well, in this village, privacy is a luxury. Families share small homes, beds, and secrets. Your new spouse might be someone you barely know, or worse, someone chosen for you by your parents when you were barely old enough to hold a knife properly. Speaking of knives, you soon discover that the wedding feast isn't just about food. It's about power plays disguised as celebration, about showing off what you have, and most importantly, about making sure everyone knows who owns whom. One surprising historical fact here. Marriages were sometimes sealed by handfasting, a ritual where the couple would literally join hands to signify their union before the church stepped in. It was a kind of contract, a binding promise, sometimes for just a year and a day. And if you think that sounds casual, scholars still argue whether these temporary unions were ever truly abandoned or simply evolved into modern engagement traditions. But not everything is grim or practical. Oddly enough, the pig you spotted rooting around the garbage might have had a symbolic role in some rural weddings, representing fertility or prosperity. Yes, medieval weddings sometimes involved animals beyond the usual bouquet toss. It's weird, it's wonderful, and yes, it's all part of the messy tapestry of human tradition. As night falls, the village quiets just a little. You lie down on a straw mattress, the rough linen scratchy against your skin, and listen to the creaks and groans of the house settling around you. You think about the fact that tonight, someone's about to marry not out of love, but because the stars say so, or the crops demand it, or their father's debts need settling. So, as you drift off, with the barnyard just a few feet away, you realize that medieval marriages weren't about fairy tales. They were about making it through another day in a harsh, unpredictable world, together. You wake up with the dawn's first light seeping through the cracks in the wooden walls, birds chirping like they're auditioning for a medieval choir. But here's the thing. Your big life event might have already been decided for you, before you even hit puberty. Yep, betrothals were arranged young, sometimes shockingly young. Imagine being promised to someone when you're still figuring out how to tie your own shoes, or more likely, how to hold a spoon without flinging food across the room. This wasn't just some awkward phase for kids. Betrothals were legally binding contracts, sometimes sealed with gifts or solemn promises, and occasionally witnessed by a gathering of relatives who were more interested in the political or financial gain than your personal feelings. Romantic love, that was, at best, an afterthought, sometimes a complete non-factor. You probably think, well, maybe they at least got a say when they got older. Scholars still argue whether childhood betrothals were always honored or if families renegotiated as kids grew up, but it's clear that for many, the choice was practically non existent. And if you broke the betrothal, expect serious social backlash. Accusations of dishonor could ruin your family's reputation or worse. Oddly, in some communities, betrothal could even happen at birth. You're lying in a cradle, and boom, you've got a fiancé or fiancée lined up. The thought of growing up with someone you barely know, and then suddenly waking up married, is enough to make you want to crawl back under the covers. Yet, this was standard. You're not special. Then there were those creepy age gaps. Imagine being a teenager married off to a man in his 30s or 40s, old enough to be your father, or even grandfather. It was horrifyingly common, especially among nobility where power, land, and alliances trumped age and compatibility. For peasants, the age gap might be narrower, but the pressure to marry young remained fierce. Early marriage meant more hands to help on the farm and more offspring to carry on the family name. Here's a quirky detail for you. Sometimes, if the bride was too young to consummate the marriage immediately, the couple would live apart for years until she reached puberty. The marriage contract was in place, but the actual, getting to know you, part waited patiently in the wings. You might think this delay gave couples time to bond emotionally. Spoiler, it often didn't. In some cases, children were betrothed simply to secure alliances or peace treaties between warring families. Your entire life could hinge on politics you barely understood, and love was just collateral damage. Think less, Romeo and Juliet, and more, Romeo and paperwork. One mainstream fact that surprises people. The church had strict rules about the minimum age for marriage, 12 for girls and 14 for boys, but enforcement was spotty at best. This means many marriages were technically illegal but socially accepted, muddying the lines between childhood and adulthood. As you mull this over, you realize how much of a lottery medieval marriage truly was. You could be lucky enough to find some affection or compatibility, but chances were, your happily ever after was a contract written by others, with little regard for your personal feelings. So, as you continue your journey through medieval matrimony, keep this in mind. You didn't choose your spouse, you were chosen. And that choice came with strings, chains, and expectations you might never shake off. You wake up on this fresh medieval morning with one thought: how much is this going to cost? Because in the Middle Ages, marriage was less about hearts and more about hands, specifically, hands exchanging dowries, bride prices, and sometimes, yes, even a goat or two. You step into the marketplace of matrimonial commerce, where daughters are assets, and your family's financial standing might rise or fall on the size of your dowry. Let's break down the financial choreography. A dowry is what the bride's family brings to the table: money, land, goods, livestock, maybe a few pigs or chickens. This wasn't a gift, in the modern sense. It was a carefully calculated investment, a way to secure your daughter's future and to attract a good match. The bigger the dowry, the better the prospects, and the more status your family could claim. But hold up, there's a twist. In some parts of Europe, the groom's family had to pay a bride price instead, a kind of buy-in fee to the bride's family. Sometimes this was money, sometimes it was livestock, sometimes it was promises of future favors or political support. Picture a medieval version of eBay, but instead of bidding on antique swords, you're haggling over a human life. Here's a quirky detail. In certain villages, if the dowry was too small or missing, brides might bring something called a morning gift to the marriage. The groom would give her land, money, or valuables the morning after the wedding as a sort of security deposit. It's like medieval insurance, just with less paperwork and more awkward breakfasts. The stakes were high. If the marriage ended, that dowry wasn't always returned, especially if the wife was at fault in the eyes of the law or church. It meant that women were, unfortunately, treated more like property to be transferred than as equal partners. A sobering reminder that, for better or worse, didn't mean what you think it means. Scholars still argue whether dowries served more to empower women by giving them some economic standing or to trap them further within patriarchal structures. It's a debate that echoes into modern discussions of marriage and money. Back in the village square, you overhear hushed negotiations between families. The groom's father scratches his beard, calculating the worth of land, livestock, and labor, while the bride's mother warns about the dangers of marrying into a family that's been on bad terms with the local lord. The bride herself, she's mostly a spectator, a pawn in this high-stakes financial chess game. So, as you sip your thin ale, you realize marriage here isn't a love story, it's a business merger. The bride's worth is tallied, debts are paid, and alliances forged, all while the villagers watch, gossip, and place bets on whether the match will last. You might think the best part is the wedding feast, but behind every slice of bread and cup of meat is the weight of these transactions. No wonder medieval weddings often lasted days. They needed time to celebrate, negotiate, and remind everyone who now owned whom. As night falls again, you consider how different marriage is today. Back then, your future might have been decided by how much your parents could offer, or demand. Love. That was, at best, a lucky side effect. You stand on the cusp of what you might think is a celebration, but really, it's a high-stakes transaction disguised in festivity. The wedding day arrives with more chaos than a rooster chase, more noise than a blacksmith's hammer, and a vibe somewhere between a rowdy tavern and a cattle auction. Here, the medieval wedding is less about candlelit vows and more about showing off who's winning the social game, and maybe getting a little messy in the process. First up, there's the handfasting. You clasp hands with your intended, the couple's bond literally sealed by this gesture before the church steps in. Scholars still argue whether handfasting was originally a temporary trial marriage or just a traditional prelude to formal ceremonies. Either way, this ritual is the kickoff, the signal that your fate is now intertwined with another's, whether you like it or not. Now, brace yourself for the wedding feast. It's not the elegant affair you'd imagine. Instead, picture long wooden tables groaning under the weight of coarse bread, salted pork, pottage that's suspiciously thick, and ale flowing like a river. No fancy champagne here. Just mead, beer, and the occasional flask of something stronger, mostly to wash down the dust and awkward glances. Animals sometimes steal the spotlight. In rural areas, a pig might be sacrificed or paraded around as a fertility symbol. Guests might have to wrestle for a piece of the wedding pie, literally fighting over food. It's loud, chaotic, and borderline brutal. You can't help but wonder how anyone manages to say, "I do," over the cacophony of laughter, shouting, and occasional insults flying faster than arrows in a battle. And then, there's the dress code. Forget white gowns and tuxedos. Brides might wear their best, often worn, clothes, sometimes dyed with natural but smelly dyes, while grooms sport whatever their status and wealth allow. Fancy silk. Rare. Practical homespun wool. More likely. You're more likely to spot mud stains than lace. One odd tradition might catch your eye. Sometimes, after the feast, the couple would be carried off, or playfully kidnapped by friends and family. It's a ritual meant to confuse evil spirits or to symbolize the transition from single life to marriage. But let's be honest, it probably just made everyone dizzy and confused, including the bride and groom. As night descends, the party rages on. Music, dancing, and storytelling fill the hall, while guests try not to fall asleep on the straw-strewn floors. The whole village is invited, from the lord's knights to the lowliest serfs. It's a communal event where status is displayed, alliances reinforced, and the lines between celebration and business blur. You learn that medieval weddings could last several days. The prolonged festivities serve multiple purposes. They allow time for negotiations to finalize, for gossip to spread, and for the community to witness the new union. There's no escaping public scrutiny here. Your every move, your behavior, even your sleep, will be observed. This brings you to an unusual fact. In some regions, the night of the wedding involved a custom called wedding waking, where the community stayed awake to guard the couple's bedchamber, ensuring no curses or evil spirits disturbed their union. The idea was sweet in theory, if not a little invasive. So, as you sit through this medieval rager, you can't help but feel that weddings back then were more about survival and social signaling than about two people falling in love. And honestly, you kind of respect that brutal honesty. You might think your parents are annoying now. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where they basically own your entire love life, and your future spouse too. Whether you're a peasant, a merchant, or a noble, your parents are the CEOs of your matchmaking process, making deals, setting terms, and occasionally throwing in a few threats to get their way. You're not just marrying another person, you're marrying your family's expectations, debts, and alliances. Your parents' priorities might baffle you. They're less interested in whether your spouse makes your heart flutter and more concerned about land, power, and social standing. That's right, your feelings are secondary to the family ledger. If your parents have their way, your wedding is a stepping stone for their own gain, a chance to climb the social ladder or patch old grudges. In noble families, this means alliances between kingdoms, even continents, might be forged through your marriage. You could be sent off to a distant land to marry a prince or princess you've never met, speaking a language you don't understand. Scholars still argue whether these arranged royal marriages fostered peace or just swapped one conflict for another. Either way, your personal desires are nowhere on the list. Peasant families. Not much different, just with fewer fancy titles and more practical concerns. Your parents want you married early to ensure more hands on the farm, more grandchildren to help with chores, and more security for the family's future. Love. Cute idea, but unrealistic in a world where survival is the priority. Now here's a quirky little detail. Some parents would hold marriage markets, where eligible children were displayed like prized livestock. Neighbors and traders would come by to inspect, negotiate, and even bid for prospective spouses. You're practically on auction. Imagine standing there, wondering if you're about to be sold for a sack of grain or a dozen chickens. Charming, right? And then there's parental meddling on a personal level, constant nagging, monitoring of your interactions, and the ever-watchful eyes during social gatherings. If you dare to defy their wishes, consequences could be severe, from social ostracism to outright violence. Your rebellion might get you disowned or worse, forced into a worse match just to set an example. One mainstream fact that might surprise you. The church sometimes sided with parents in disputes over marriages, reinforcing parental authority and making it harder for young people to escape unwanted unions. Religious and social structures teamed up to keep control firmly in the hands of the older generation. So as you try to imagine your life under such strict watch, you realize that love was often a silent, secret thing, something whispered in stolen moments or kept locked away in letters. Publicly, you played the part assigned to you by your parents, while privately, you might have dreamed of something different. It's a tough reality. Your parents are both your protectors and your jailers in this medieval romance saga, and their influence shapes every step you take toward the altar. You step into the village chapel, a small stone building smelling faintly of incense, damp stone, and the echoes of countless whispered prayers. The church holds enormous sway over marriage in the Middle Ages, not just as a religious institution but as the ultimate authority on who could marry whom, when, and how. It's not just about blessing your union, it's about control, rules, and a whole lot of paperwork. Here's a fact that might surprise you. Marriage wasn't always considered a sacrament by the church until the 12th century. Before that, it was more of a social contract sealed by families and communities. Then the church stepped in to formalize the process, insisting on public ceremonies and witness testimonies to prevent secret marriages and disputes over legitimacy. You move quietly past wooden pews as the priest prepares to conduct a wedding. His robes swish softly as he recites the liturgy in Latin, a language most of the villagers don't understand but respect nonetheless. The ceremony's tone is solemn, heavy with tradition and the weight of divine approval. The church imposed strict rules, like prohibiting marriages between close relatives, though what counted as close could be surprisingly broad, requiring parental consent, and demanding that weddings take place in a consecrated space. Marriages outside the church could be deemed invalid, leaving offspring illegitimate and vulnerable. Here's a quirky detail. To prove that a couple wasn't secretly married, the church introduced the concept of the bans. Public announcements of an upcoming wedding read aloud in church for 3 consecutive Sundays. If anyone knew of legal reasons to stop the marriage, they were supposed to speak up. In practice, this was less about romance and more about maintaining social order and property rights. Scholars still argue whether these church interventions empowered individuals by protecting them from forced or secret marriages, or if they simply reinforced existing power structures, limiting personal freedom even further. Either way, the church's role shaped marriage into something more formal, regulated, and, well, official. But the church didn't just police who could marry, it also influenced wedding customs. For example, the exchange of rings became a significant ritual, symbolizing eternal commitment, a tradition that evolved from earlier pagan practices. And the I do vows. Those started appearing around this period too, replacing older customs like handfasting. You notice the couple exchanging these vows under the watchful eyes of the community. The moment is a blend of hope, fear, and obligation, all underscored by the presence of the divine. This ceremony isn't just about two people, it's about families, communities, and the church intertwining in a contract that defines social and spiritual order. As the ceremony ends, you step outside into the fresh air, realizing how marriage in the Middle Ages was as much a political and religious event as a personal one. Love might have happened somewhere in the background, but it was never the star of the show. You walk through the dusty streets after the ceremony, but marriage doesn't mean the story's over. Now comes the awkward, often painful part, consummation. This is when the marriage officially becomes, well, official. Until you share that first night, the church, and the law, didn't fully recognize the union. It's like the final seal on the deal, but instead of a signature, it's a lot more intimate. Here's a historical fact that's hard to swallow. Many brides were not physically or emotionally ready for this moment. Girls married as young as 12 or 13 faced the daunting task of consummating their marriage with sometimes much older men. Scholars still argue about how much choice or consent was involved, but it's clear that young brides often suffered through this rite of passage with little agency. If you imagine a candlelit romantic night, think again. The truth is far messier, sometimes painful, and often frightening. A lack of knowledge about sex, combined with societal pressure, created an atmosphere of anxiety and confusion. Some couples reportedly had to be coached by older women or midwives on what to do, because these conversations were taboo. An odd detail. In some medieval texts, there are instructions for men on how to prepare their brides for consummation, including advice on calming nerves and ensuring the bride's purity. It's a bizarre mix of medical, spiritual, and social advice that underscores how much pressure was placed on this single act. And then there's the whole issue of virginity. The bride's virginity was a prized possession, tied to family honor and social standing. The pressure to prove it on the wedding night was immense. Some families even hired experts to check the bride's hymen afterward. Yep, really, and failure could mean scandal or worse. Talk about a stressful first night. But here's the kicker. Consummation wasn't always immediate. In noble circles, if the bride was very young, the couple might live apart for months or even years before consummating the marriage. It's a strange limbo where you're legally married but not physically united, a setup scholars still debate about. In terms of its emotional impact, if consummation didn't happen, annulments were sometimes possible, though rare and complicated. The church took a serious stance on marriage permanence, but even they recognized that some unions just didn't work, at least not yet. You start to see that consummation wasn't just a personal milestone, it was loaded with social, legal, and religious significance. It marked the transition from childhood to adulthood, from contract to real union. As the candle flickers low, you can almost feel the tension and vulnerability that must have hung in the air during those medieval wedding nights. Not exactly the fairy tale ending you might have imagined, but real, raw. You wake the next day with a heavy head and heavier thoughts. The life of a medieval married person isn't all feasts and festivities, it's backbreaking work, constant responsibility, and a social role that demands more than you might expect. Marriage here is a lifelong contract, binding you to duties that stretch far beyond the wedding night. For women, the role is especially demanding. You're expected to manage the household, bear children, lots of them, and ensure the family's survival through lean years and better ones. Childbirth itself was risky. Many women didn't survive their first or second pregnancy. Your worth might be measured in your ability to produce heirs, especially sons, to carry on the family name. Men, on the other hand, shoulder the responsibility of providing for the family, working the land, or managing trade and political alliances. Your status and honor are wrapped up in your ability to protect and support your new household. Failure is not an option, Survival depends on cooperation and resilience. Here's a quirky detail that's less well known. In some medieval villages, couples were expected to share a bed not just for intimacy but for practical reasons, like warmth during harsh winters. It's cozy until you remember that straw mattresses were often shared with the occasional insect or rodent. Romantic. Debatable. Daily life didn't leave much room for private moments. Your personal desires are often secondary to the family's needs and community expectations. Gossip flows faster than wine, and any misstep can damage reputations that took generations to build. Scholars still argue about the emotional dynamics within medieval marriages. Some evidence suggests love and companionship did exist, but others emphasize the transactional nature of these unions. It likely varied wildly depending on class, location, and individual personalities. You also face the reality that divorce was nearly impossible. The church viewed marriage as indissoluble, and legal separations were rare and difficult. If things went sour, you had to endure, often trapped in unhappy or even abusive relationships. Leaving meant social exile and financial ruin for many. A surprisingly modern-sounding fact. Some couples found ways to express affection through small, everyday acts, sharing food, working together, or private jokes. Love might have been quiet, hidden beneath layers of duty and expectation, but it wasn't entirely absent. As you absorb all this, you realize marriage in the Middle Ages was a complex blend of hardship, responsibility, and sometimes, surprisingly, genuine human connection. Not the storybook romance you expected, but real life, gritty, messy, and full of contradictions. You might think medieval weddings were just about the couple and their families, but the whole community played a starring role in the drama. Marriage was a public event, a communal affair where every villager had a stake and a say. You step into a world where your reputation, alliances, and even future conflicts are shaped in front of an audience. Weddings served as social glue, reinforcing the bonds that held the village or town together. Guests weren't just there to celebrate, they were there to witness, judge, and sometimes meddle. Your behavior at the wedding feast could make or break your social standing. Overindulge in mead, and whispers start. Refuse a dance, and you might offend a powerful ally. A quirky detail to consider. In some places, guests would bring wedding gifts that were anything but generous. Sometimes these were practical gifts, tools, animals, or food, but in other cases, they were thinly veiled bribes or tests of loyalty. Imagine receiving a sack of rotten potatoes instead of a basket of apples, just to see how you handle embarrassment. Scholars still debate how much these communal weddings served to maintain social order versus providing genuine celebration and joy. The line between political theater and festivity was blurry at best. The wedding feast itself was an elaborate spectacle. You imagine long tables laden with food that's part feast, part show. There might be minstrels playing, jesters juggling, and nobles exchanging gossip while the peasants chew on whatever scraps remain. Everyone has a role. The Lord presides, the priest blesses, and the village fools entertain. Another odd tradition involved rough music, a cacophony made by guests banging pots, horns, and drums to ward off evil spirits or to celebrate the new couple's union. It was noisy, chaotic, and sometimes downright rude. Perfect for a medieval party, right? Beyond the festivities, the community's approval was crucial. Gossip and rumors could stick like barnacles, affecting your family's fortunes for years. Marriage wasn't just personal, it was a public performance where your every move was scrutinized. As you observe the villagers, you realize that a medieval wedding was less about two people starting a life together and more about the whole community reshuffling its social deck. The bride and groom were the centerpiece, but the real story was about relationships, power, and survival. So next time you attend a wedding, spare a thought for the medieval couple whose big day was less about romance and more about public pressure, politics, and the endless dance of social expectation. You've seen the big, loud, and often awkward wedding day, but what about the marriage itself? Once the guests leave and the feast is over, you're left with the reality of married life, a world where survival, negotiation, and adaptation become your new normal. One thing you quickly realize is that medieval marriages were often less about passion and more about partnership. Couples needed to cooperate, dividing labor and responsibilities to manage households, farms, and businesses. It's not glamorous, but it's practical. You learn to appreciate the rhythm of shared work, where love might grow slowly in the background or never at all. Here's a historical fact. In some regions, spouses had specific legal rights and duties codified in local laws or customs. For example, in parts of England, husbands were required to provide maintenance for their wives, while wives were expected to manage domestic affairs and sometimes run family shops. This mutual dependency shaped the marriage dynamic in unexpected ways. But don't think medieval spouses always got along. Arguments over money, fidelity, and household management were common. Divorce was rare but not impossible, usually granted only on strict grounds like adultery or abandonment. More often, couples endured unhappy marriages, bound by religious and social expectations. An odd detail. In some communities, couples could separate informally, living apart without dissolving the marriage legally. These trial separations allowed a cooling off period, but often came with social stigma and economic hardship. Imagine explaining that to your neighbors. Scholars still argue about how love and affection played out in these arrangements. Did companionship arise from shared struggles, or did marriages remain cold and transactional? Evidence suggests both, depending on the individuals involved. Medieval marriage also intersected with gender roles sharply. Women, though often seen as subordinate, wielded significant influence within the household and sometimes even beyond, especially if widowed. Men's authority was balanced by women's knowledge of domestic affairs, childcare, and social networks. You start to see marriage as a negotiation, a daily balancing act between duty and desire, authority and partnership. It's not always pretty, but it's real. So as you imagine the quiet mornings and long evenings of medieval couples, you recognize that marriage was less about grand gestures and more about the small, sometimes unnoticed moments that build a life together. You step into the shadowy corners of medieval marriage, infidelity. Yes, despite all the strict rules, expectations, and social pressures, cheating was very much part of the story. It's easy to assume the Middle Ages were all about rigid morality, but the reality is messier and, frankly, more human. Both men and women strayed from their vows, though the consequences differed wildly. Men's infidelities were often overlooked or quietly tolerated, especially among the nobility, where political alliances mattered more than personal virtue. Women, on the other hand, faced harsher judgments and harsher punishments. Scholars still argue whether this double standard was enforced universally or varied by region and class, but it's clear the scales were tipped against women. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some medieval courts even had gossip trials, where neighbors testified about suspected affairs. These trials could be vicious, fueled by jealousy, rivalry, and sometimes downright boredom. The accused might have to swear oaths or undergo humiliating ordeals to prove innocence, or guilt. Interestingly, adultery wasn't always purely about lust. Sometimes it was a form of protest, a way to seek affection denied in marriage, or even a political act to undermine rival families. You realize that medieval marriage, like today, was tangled in webs of emotion, power, and survival. The church condemned adultery harshly, preaching about sin and punishment, but enforcement was inconsistent. Penalties ranged from public shaming and fines to exile or imprisonment, especially for women. Yet, many affairs flew under the radar, whispered about but never officially acknowledged. One surprising fact: some medieval lovers exchanged secret tokens, embroidered handkerchiefs, coded letters, or symbolic gifts, to communicate their feelings. These clandestine romances reveal a hidden world beneath the surface of arranged unions and social contracts. You start to see infidelity as a shadowy subplot in medieval marriage, a reminder that love and desire rarely fit neatly into rules and rituals. It adds a layer of complexity to what might seem like a rigid institution. So, as you imagine the whispered secrets, stolen glances, and whispered confessions, you realize that medieval marriages were as human and flawed as any you know today. You now wander into the world of wedding customs and superstitions, where belief and ritual intertwine in ways that might surprise you. Marriage wasn't just a legal or religious contract, it was also a moment charged with superstition, meant to protect, bless, or curse the union depending on who was watching. Here's a fascinating historical fact. Many medieval weddings included rituals designed to ward off evil spirits or bad luck. For example, throwing grain, coins, or even beans at the newlyweds was common. These offerings were believed to bring fertility, prosperity, and protection against witches or misfortune. Imagine standing there as a shower of peas pelts you. Romantic, right? And then there's the peculiar tradition of bridal cries, where the bride would wail loudly before the ceremony. This wasn't just melodrama, it was thought to scare away evil spirits and signal the bride's transition from maidenhood to married life. A bit like an ancient version of screaming into a pillow, but with community approval. Scholars still debate the origins and meanings of many of these customs. Were they genuine spiritual beliefs, social performances, or simply ways to make weddings more memorable? The truth is probably a mix of all three. Another odd custom involved the mock bride, where a friend or relative might stand in for the bride during part of the ceremony or celebrations to confuse evil spirits or jealous rivals. This little deception shows just how seriously people took the risks associated with marriage. Superstitions didn't end at the wedding. Couples followed specific practices to ensure marital harmony and fertility, like sleeping with particular herbs, wearing certain colors, or avoiding unlucky days. Breaking these rules could spell disaster, or so the stories went. You realize that medieval marriage was steeped in a worldview where the natural and supernatural coexisted, and rituals offered comfort in a world full of uncertainties. Love, fate, and faith blended together in ceremonies and customs that might seem strange now but felt essential then. As you take all this in, you see that marriage was more than just a social or religious event, it was a deeply symbolic moment filled with hope, fear, and the desire for a happy future. You settle into the quiet aftermath of the wedding season and find yourself reflecting on the role of children in medieval marriages. It's a chapter often overlooked, but crucial to understanding how marriage really worked back then. Children weren't just the happy bonus of marriage, they were the very purpose for many unions. Producing heirs, especially sons, was a matter of legacy, property, and survival. Families needed children to inherit land, carry on names, and continue traditions. You quickly realize that every pregnancy was loaded with expectation and pressure. A stark historical fact: infant mortality rates were shockingly high. It wasn't uncommon for families to lose several children before one survived to adulthood. This constant risk shaped the emotional landscape of marriage, making every birth a tentative hope rather than a guaranteed joy. Here's an odd detail. Some medieval parents baptized their newborns immediately after birth, sometimes with midwives performing the rite if the priest wasn't available. This urgency reflected both religious beliefs and harsh realities. Unbaptized children were thought to wander in limbo if they died, a terrifying prospect for devout families. Scholars still argue about the emotional bonds between parents and children in this era. Was detachment a coping mechanism for inevitable loss, or did love flourish despite harsh circumstances? Evidence suggests it varied widely, with some parents deeply devoted and others resigned to fate. Marriage also involved educating and preparing children for their future roles, often from infancy. Boys might learn skills like farming or swordsmanship, while girls were trained in household management and obedience. These early lessons set the stage for the next generation's marriages and social roles. You notice how the cycle of marriage, childbirth, and childrearing created a rhythm that defined medieval family life. Each birth was a thread woven into the fabric of community and continuity. As you watch a mother cradle her newborn, you glimpse the fragile yet fierce hope embedded in every medieval marriage, the hope that love, life, and legacy would endure despite the odds. You now drift into the world of wedding celebrations, feasts, dances, and the wild moments that might surprise you. Medieval weddings weren't just formal ceremonies, they were often boisterous, messy, and sometimes downright raucous affairs. Here's a fact. While nobles might enjoy elaborate banquets with exotic foods and musicians, common folks' weddings were marked by simple, hearty fare, think hearty bread, cheese, and plenty of ale to wash it down. Feasts could last days, with dancing, games, and sometimes rowdy competitions. One quirky detail is the bride's pie, a savory or sweet pastry that held surprises inside, sometimes a ring, a coin, or even a pea. Finding the ring meant good luck or early marriage, the coin promised wealth, the pea, well, less fortunate fates. It was a medieval version of a party game with real stakes. Scholars still debate whether these festivities served more to celebrate love or to reinforce social hierarchies and alliances. The loud laughter and music masked the serious business of community bonding and property negotiations that weddings also involved. Dancing was central to these celebrations, but it wasn't always graceful or elegant. Think stomping feet, clapping hands, and some questionable moves by guests who'd had a bit too much mead. In some regions, rough dancing was the norm, energetic, boisterous, and often involving the entire village. Another odd tradition. Some weddings featured the pulling of the glove, a playful tug of war between the bride's and groom's families, symbolizing their new alliance and the inevitable negotiations ahead. Imagine that as your first family game night. These celebrations were the social highlight of the year, a chance for everyone to let loose, reaffirm ties, and maybe spark a little romance in the crowd. Despite the seriousness of marriage itself, the feast showed that joy and human connection were never far away. So as you picture the laughter, spilled wine, and dancing feet, you realize medieval weddings were a complex mix of solemn vows and joyful chaos, a perfect reflection of the human experience. You're almost at the end of this winding journey through medieval marriage, and now it's time to reflect on the lasting legacy of these unions. What sticks with you is how much marriage back then was a blend of survival, politics, religion, and, occasionally, unexpected tenderness. Marriage shaped every aspect of life, from birthright and power to everyday chores and personal identity. It wasn't a simple love story but a multifaceted contract that could bring both security and suffering. You see echoes of these old practices in modern traditions, even if the stakes have thankfully changed. A curious fact. Some medieval marriage customs have surprisingly survived into today's wedding rituals. The exchanging of rings, the bridal procession, and even certain superstitions about luck and fertility. It's fascinating to realize how these echoes of the past still resonate in contemporary ceremonies. Scholars still argue about how romantic medieval marriages really were. While many were clearly arranged and strategic, there were stories of genuine affection and companionship. It wasn't a one-size-fits-all experience but a spectrum of human emotion and social obligation. You recognize that medieval marriage, with all its flaws and complexities, offers a mirror to our own ideas about love, commitment, and partnership. Behind the pageantry and rules, there were people navigating uncertainty, hope, and desire, just like you. As you close this chapter of history, take a moment to appreciate the messy, beautiful reality of human relationships across time. The past isn't a fairy tale, but it's full of stories that can still whisper lessons to us tonight. Like, share this video with dear. Subscribe our YouTube channel, The Best Way of Sleeping, for more related videos.